welcome to our employment salon, where we bring together experts from around the world to join in a discussion about labor market policies, employment services, and how they can be designed to create more inclusive and equitable opportunities for all. Today, we're joined by Ingrid Muschta, Director of Special Projects and Innovation at Ontario Disability Employment Network, Sirlis Sõmer-Kull, member of the management board of the Estonian Insurance Fund, Konstantina Leveti, head of policy at the European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disabilities in Brussels, and last but by no means least, Torres Fremlin, editor at Disability Debrief UK. We're really honored to have such an esteemed panel to join us today. Today, our webinar focuses on the labor market integration of persons with disabilities. The discussion is both timely and essential, as it addresses one of the most persistent barriers to true social and economic inclusion. The ability to work is not only a matter of financial independence, but also dignity, self-determination, and full participation in society. Yet, despite extensive policy commitments at national and international levels, persons with disabilities remain significantly underrepresented in workforce. On a global scale, the right to work is clearly enshrined in the Article 27 of the United Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which calls for equal access to employment, reasonable accommodation, and protection from discrimination. The European Union has further reinforced these commitments through their European Disability Rights Strategy 2021-2030 and the European Pillar of Social Rights, both of which emphasize the need for inclusive labor markets. However, the reality on the ground remains stark. Data from OECD and the European Commission show that employment rates for persons with disabilities have stagnated, in some cases even worsened. One of the fundamental reasons of this employment gap is still skills deficit that many persons with disabilities face. The OECD has noted that people with disabilities are often at disadvantage when it comes to acquiring and developing the necessary skills for modern market. Without sufficient access to education, vocational training, and lifelong learning, persons with disabilities are not on equal footing when applying for jobs or maintaining employment in an increasingly competitive and digitalized world. Compounding this issue, workplaces and recruitment processes are frequently not designed to be inclusive, meaning that qualified individuals with disabilities still struggle to gain employment due to structural barriers and employer biases. At European and national levels, we have seen many approaches. For example, at United Kingdom, the government has implemented the Disability Confidence Scheme, which supports employers in recruiting and retaining workers with disabilities. However, ongoing debates about the sickness benefits reforms suggest that much more needs to be done to align social protection with employment incentives. In many European countries, there are more prescriptive policies. Companies with more than 15 or 20 employees are regularly legally required to ensure that at least 5% of their workforce consists of persons with disabilities, or they pay a levy. And while these initiatives present a positive step forward, they also raise an important question about effectiveness of mainstreaming disability employment services versus maintaining specialized support. In some countries, we have noticed employment services for persons with disabilities are being merged into broader public employment schemes with the goal of improving efficiency. That debate over mainstreaming versus specialized support is particularly relevant in the context of performance-based funding models, which can incentivize quick job placement over long-term sustainable employment. Beyond policy, employer attitudes and workplace accessibility remain significant barriers. Many employers are willing to hire persons with disabilities, but lack guidance, incentives, or reassurances to do so effectively. Public procurement incentives, wage subsidies, or employer engagement strategies have been introduced in a number of countries to encourage inclusive hiring. But these measures need to be better aligned with broader labor market policies. Last but not least, as automation and digitalization reshape the world of work, there's growing concern that persons with disabilities could be further marginalized if emerging technologies are not designed with accessibility in mind. While digital tools and assistive technologies have the potential to break barriers, they could be great leveling tool. They can also create new forms of exclusion if they are not built to accommodate these diverse needs. Today's webinar will explore those issues in greater detail, bringing together experts who will share their insights from their respective fields. As we listen to today's discussion, I encourage us to reflect on a fundamental question. Are we designing employment systems that fit people, or are we still expecting people to fit into rigid employment schemes? If we're truly to build inclusive labor market, we must move beyond policy intention to tangible actions that break down barriers, empower individuals, and create workplaces where everyone has the opportunity to contribute and thrive. With that, let's begin our discussion. Dear Eamon, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anya, for a very helpful and interesting introduction to this really crucial subject. I'd like, if I may, to first bring in Ingrid. Canada has been at the forefront, Ingrid, I'm sure as you know very much, from many experiments in changing the way that services are being delivered for a long time. Probably for the last 25 years, we've heard about developments with Service Canada particularly. From your perspective, have you a view about how far the changes which have been kind of happening in Ontario recently, they've been quite significant as far as I can understand, an idea to move to perhaps a more integrated performance-driven model with this sort of management by large service management through centres? I mean, what's the reality of the new system? Is it actually having the responses and results that were intended, or have there been some unintended consequences? And how far do you think this new service delivery model has really kind of made the situation, hopefully, of job seekers with disabilities better in terms of their ability to access the system? Or have there been real problems which unfortunately have moved things in the opposite direction, really? So what's your perspective on that particularly, Ingrid, first? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. That's a big question, and the implications of that question are also quite big. So in Ontario, we have been going through what we have been calling the employment integrated system transformation, where the main aim was to provide efficiencies in the system by bringing three programs under one umbrella. So people who have a disability were accessing what was called the Ontario Disability Support Program, employment supports, managed by one particular ministry. Then there was the Ontario Works, social assistance, managed by municipalities, and then what was managed by our Ministry of Labour, which is Employment Ontario. So you can see how governments wanted to create efficiencies where three different programs were providing access to employment supports to three different populations. So the intent, the aim was to bring efficiency by bringing everybody under one umbrella, create more locally responsive employment supports for employers who had admitted or who had brought to the government the fact that accessing supports from an employer perspective from organizations that didn't understand the nuances of each local community was difficult. So that's where this concept of creating service system managers came from, to provide localized, locally responsive employment supports, not just for the people who are looking for work, but also for the employers who are trying to hire these people. So the intentions are good. You can see how that can really be efficient and probably trying to be more responsive. The implications, however, have been that a large administrative burden has been put on small organizations that were providing very specialized services for people who have a disability. That has been the issue. And in trying to get to this efficiency, and in trying to get to this concept that everybody can be served at any door, organizations that had never provided supports for barrier groups, such as people who have gone through the justice system and did not have those specializations, are now expected to do so. So I'll give you a very simple example. We have a number of organizations called community living organizations here, whose only mission has always been to support people who have developmental disabilities. Under this new umbrella of employment supports, now they're expected to serve anybody. And that's where the crux of the issue comes. That you now have employment supports that were not specifically designed to support everybody, and those employment supports teams don't have the capacity. You're expected to now comply to a number of regulations, or not regulations, but through a number of administrative processes that smaller organizations did not have the initial capacity. And you still comply to your funder. And then the third thing is, now you have organizations who, from a size of teams, are capable, have the capacity to serve anybody, but don't have the expertise on how to work with somebody who has high needs from a disability perspective. So, I could go on and on, but I don't think I'm supposed to. So I don't know if that has answered your question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
The system was meant to be efficient, but in doing so, we have inadvertently created a number of barriers for a number of people.
Thank you very much. I mean, so in your role as Director of Special Projects and Innovation, I suppose you've got a particular interest, Ingrid, first of all, in trying to ensure that systems are becoming more user-friendly and more helpfully orientated towards the end users, the public, and also employers as well, of course, but also trying to make sure that people with specific kind of needs based on their kind of individual circumstances not being lost in it, and that's trying to square that particular circle. And I think what you've described is a kind of ambitious approach from no wrong door, bringing different levels of governance together. But the issue is there a risk of actually moving from efficiencies to economies, maybe, perhaps one thing, and inadvertently kind of a situation where certain groups of people are going to be less able to access services than before. Thinking of that, from my reading of the developments in Ontario at the moment, sort of digital, almost by default, seems becoming more and more the kind of approach, a very, very strong emphasis on digital kind of contact. I mean, is enough being done to meet the needs of people with disabilities through that kind of delivery interface? I mean, have their needs been thought at all before this concept was brought in?
Well, I think that the answer will depend on the type of disability that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I think for people with episodic disabilities who do not have a sensory disability, digital has been a game changer. That concept that you could access from your home services and work, and that came through from the pandemic, right? When we all became very digitally, we were imposed, our workforce was imposed to work digitally. And for people who had certain types of disabilities was an advantage. I go back to the concept of depending on the disability. For people who have developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, for whom just regular literacy has been an issue. To Anya's point, when the educational system is not preparing people to have the skills that you need to enter the workforce, it doesn't matter what system you're entering. So if you don't have literacy and numeracy as you're leaving the educational system, you're already at a disadvantage in a system that is also creating more barriers when you're looking for employment. So for rural communities, for people who have certain types of disabilities, digital connection, digital access is truly not there. And then there is this, I don't even want to get into how other pieces of our digital world are creating even more barriers. You know, when we think about how much AI and other techniques are being utilized to support employment. So virtual reality is a big thing for us now, you know, in terms of supporting skill development in the workforce. How are we ensuring that people who have sensory needs or have sensory disabilities are able to access those employment readiness programs? How are we ensuring that people with developmental disabilities who are already at a disadvantage because of low literacy levels are accessing those programs? I think there isn't a right answer in here. For some people, digital access has increased, or the digital transformation has allowed them more access to employment services. For other people, it has has created more barriers. And this is where we come to this concept of one size does not fit everybody. Yeah. We cannot remove the personal interactions, the one-on-one supports, the job coaching that is so needed for some people to really learn how to do the work, really learn how to get those skills that they need in order to be successful in the workplace. And even for employers, you know, we are here talking about how all of this is transforming and impacting job seekers, but we should not forget that it also has an impact on employers who are depending on those specialized services to support them as a client in this ecosystem of workforce development.
Thank you. Perhaps finally, Ingrid, before we move on, you mentioned the kind of move really for more and more people to be participating in employment readiness programs in Ontario, but that kind of infers that people are at a certain kind of level to be able to benefit from those programs before they're referred to them. Is enough being done to make sure that people are ready to engage in those programs? And is there any kind of structured kind of pipeline that at a very early stage people can be given some kind of early preparation, very much looking at what their needs are before they're channeled through a certain pathway, which might be full of lots of assumptions about their work readiness, essentially?
We have programs, and I think that everybody that is in workforce development would say that there are pre-employment programs, you know, to support resume writing, interview readiness. But I think as we go through our transformation and come to the other end, we realize that a lot of time needs to be, depending on the disability, that pre-employment readiness piece can take quite a bit of time. And this is where this efficiency, this transforming to efficiencies can, you know, take away some of that time that is required, particularly for people who have never had an experience in work. And I fall back in this concept of workforce development cannot be seen as an isolated piece in a society. It needs to be integrated with with education and with business awareness, building that awareness for businesses to help them identify that by hiring youth who have a disability, they're preparing those youth, that talent pipeline, to better serve them once they come out of work. The employer becomes more disability confident when they're hiring youth, because then they begin to understand how they can implement accommodations. It really is a bit of a web in terms of how a community could be preparing to create and support the jobs that people who have a disability will need. You know, if we could only come from and at ODEN, we've done a little bit of research on the impact of youth and work for youth who have a developmental disability. And throughout the research, we've identified that when families have higher expectations, that work is a viable goal for their child, When schools do a better job of providing work opportunities for youth before they leave the educational system, so through co-ops and true meaningful co-ops, not within the school system, but out in community with businesses that are hiring. So when co-op and work opportunities are provided, when employment service providers make themselves more familiar with both the family and the educational system, and when businesses are incentivized, and I'm not necessarily meaning just with funding, but incentivized to understand that when they hire youth, they're preparing that talent pipeline where all those elements are in place. Those people, those young people have a better chance of attaching themselves to employment and being supported more because everybody's on the same page in regards to what their future and the workplace looks like.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and raises all sorts of questions actually about the role of work in wider society, the value we actually kind of ascribe to people's participation in work, and the way that certain sort of employment is kind of perhaps not given the value and credit it should actually be done in the wider context as well. Thank you very much indeed. If I can move on to Sirlis now, if I may, from the managing board of Estonia. Sirlis, your country's been, I think, pretty famous for the workability reforms going back in a number of years recently, and I think quite rightly held up as an exemplar of some international best practice in the role of public employment services into kind of integrating people perhaps a long way from employment back into the labour market. Could you give us perhaps a very brief overview of why your workability reforms were initially instituted in Estonia, and what are the kind of main features of the programme, if that's okay? So just a bit of a brief overview for the workability reforms. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. At first, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. And I'm sorry about my voice. I'm a bit sick, but I'll try to do my best not to lose my voice during the discussion. But of course, so what is this? What do we call workability reform? It's a reform that actually started 10 years ago. So enough time has passed, and now we can assess the impact of a reform already. And the objective of a reform was to increase the labour market activity of people with reduced workability and slow down their number and cost of benefits. So why the reform was initially introduced? Reform was prompted by the steady rise in the number of people permanently unable to work, and of course the costs of incapacity for work pension. The number of incapacity for work pensioners increased almost 90% between the years 2000 and 2011. And also, so in 10 years, it increased 90%. It's really, really huge. And also between the years 2011 and 2015, the number of incapacity for work pensioners increased by 11%. So it was really heavy burden to the incapacity for work pension budget. And why the number of incapacity for work pensioners was growing and also this budget burden, it was mainly because that the previous system of incapacity for work pension system encouraged passivity, with people entering into the system but almost never leaving out of the system. And also incapacity assessment was based on diagnosis. But if you know that not all the diseases does not always cause functional limitations. So the assessment was not based on the people's actual limitations. And also incapacity for work pensioners were mainly out of the labour market. So there was not much support for them to find a job, and also employers were not very eager to have them as employers. And the employment rate of people with reduced workability was low. Half of people with disability were neither working nor looking for work, and only 3% were registered as unemployed and looking for a job through the unemployment insurance fund. So more than half of people with disabilities were out of the labour market. Frankly, if we may say so, they were sitting at home. There was a low participation in society in general. And the situation was not reasonable from a point of view of the people, but also from a point of view of a state. So, and the significant part of a working age population did not have the opportunity to contribute to the economy. So the reform was launched in 2016, and it has 4 main objectives. First, the growth of a number of disability pensioners and recipients of workability allowance will slow down in the first years and decrease in the long run. The second objective was to provide better access to the labour market for people with different health impairments and disabilities by providing support and range of measures. There was also an indicator that by the year 2021, 50% of people of working age with a partial workability will be employed. A third objective was that the ability of people with reduced working capacity to find work is increasing and their economic situation is improving. And the fourth objective was that cost saving and financial sustainability of a new system will be achieved compared to the cost forecast based on the situation before workability reform. So what did we do? There were like 5 main actions, actually. The first one, we changed the workability assessment methodology. So the new workability assessment methodology is based off international classification of functioning, and it looks how the medical condition affects person's functional capacity. So as a result, person can be able to work, partially able to work, or not able to work. And the workability assessment provides recommendations also, suitable working conditions and unemployment services. So assessment is based on both a person's self-assessment and medical confirmed information about restrictions. So functional capacity assessment is a good input also for best case managers to help and assist person in identifying the type of employment best suited for their abilities and aspiration, and also to assist person to find most suitable employment services. So the second change was that the flat rate workability benefit replaced traditional incapacity or work pension. And the third activity was that there is an activity requirement for action. There is an activity requirement, which means that persons who are partially able to work are entitled to workability benefit only if they are active, working, studying, or looking for work with the support of PES. So it's really one important change that also people are responsible, they have to be active. But of course, not only people have to be active, but there have to be measures available to support them. So the fourth activity was there a number of new or adjusted employment measures are now available for disabled job seekers and employees. And the new services were, for example, vocational rehabilitation service, supported employment, peer counseling, employers counseling, and some services were adjusted, like workplace adaptation, technical aids, wage subsidies, social tax. So quite nice or wide package of services are now available, which were not available before the reform. And also not only employment services, but also social services are important. So with the reform, the task of assessing workability was also transferred from the Social Insurance Board to Employment Insurance Fund. So all the activities are under the one umbrella, under the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And in 2022, we had a chance to assess the impact of workability reform. So we could assess, as I mentioned, there were 4 main objectives of a reform. So now we assessed how did we do. And the goal of employing people with partial workability set for workability reform was met. So, for example, in 2020, 61% of people with partial workability were employed. 17% registered as unemployed. So in altogether, 78% were working or looking for a job. So it's a quite high percentage being active. And the remaining 22% were among men were people who were studying or caregivers, or they were active in some other way, or maybe they were taking care of their health. So it can be said that the ability of people with reduced ability to find a job increased, and then the goal was met. And also people say themselves that they feel that their standard of living has improved slightly. And also we got also the costs were under the control. So in conclusion, according to the evaluation of workability reform research results in 2022, the study concludes that the workability reform was an appropriate and effective measure that had a positive effect on employment growth of people with reduced workability. And in addition to the monetary effects, workability reform has additional effects such as increase in the overall quality of life due to the employment of people with reduced workability, and alleviation of labor shortage, and an increase in cohesion of society. So it was actually a successful program with many different activities.
Thank you. That was a very kind of helpful and rich overview of the developments in Estonia, sir. It's one thing I think Estonia is very famous for, of course, is for being one of the most digitally well-connected societies and governance systems anywhere. One of the potential benefits from that degree of digitalization is presumably the ability to gather lots of useful data to maybe offer more personalized services if possible. Could you give us perhaps a brief overview of how far you've been able to use the extent of digitalization in your country to gather some of that personalized data to really try and establish exactly what is the best kind of fit for an individual for the kind of support being offered by the employment service potentially? So how individualized data assists you helping clients? Thank you.
Yeah, Estonian PES is using the number of digitized solutions, for example, from service provision, automated decision-making, profiling, cross-data use to provide services, and also to use the data to assess the impact of services. I don't know, I just can give some examples. So we have like fully automated processes, for example, registration as unemployed. It takes less than 1 minute from application to decision. So also people with disabilities can register as unemployed using their iPhone, for example. But of course, we must always remember that not everyone has IT skills. So there must always be a way to communicate or submit a request using, for example, face-to-face channel. So we have a lot of digital tools, but still we have to keep in mind that even in Estonia, all people are not so, that doesn't have so good digital skills. So we always have to have different channels available for people, also face-to-face channel, for example. But yeah, for example, I don't know so much about specialized services, but for example, what we do, we use the data. For example, we have processes which are carried out fully in the information system. For example, the workability assessment, what I just talked about. It's also possible to apply and have a decision, and all this process it's fully in a system, and we don't have any paper, or don't use any paper in the process, and we use data exchange. We use X-Road, we call it in a way X-Road in Estonia, and X-Road we call an open source software and ecosystem solution that provides unified and secure data exchange between private and public sector organizations. Is a backbone of Estonia, and invisibility yet crucial. It allows the nation's various public and private sectors e-service information system to link up and function in harmony. So as the whole assessment process can be carried out without any paper. So it makes it easier for the person to apply employability assessment, and person does not need to collect different data and submit them to the unemployment fund. The data are available in different national registers. So for example, in health register, education register, and it's less burden for the individual. So and it also reduces the risk that the person would have to repeatedly provide the same data to the state. And if a state already has the data once, we can use the data for an intended purpose, data cross-use.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's extremely helpful. I think a lot of the studies suggest that one of the biggest problems where data is collected various times is organizations can never ask the same question exactly the same way, so people end up with slightly different kind of views as to what the situation is, and it really kind of prevents a proper holistic service delivery. So thank you very much for that. Extremely interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to that. Konstantina, perhaps looking at your role from the European Association of Service Providers for People with Disabilities in a bit of a European perspective. One thing that Anya and I really kind of found again and again, doing a bit of background reading and research for today's discussion, was a real shift towards an intention anyway to shift towards more mainstreamed employment support rather than specific programs focused on people's disability. I mean, in one sense, if we were genuinely looking at very much a personalized approach rather than a kind of labeling approach, categorizing people, that could be very, very positive. But of course, the other issue is if that's not done properly, you end up with a service which is less likely to meet the needs of somebody with a disability. So they're two really kind of quite extreme ends of the spectrum, essentially. I mean, is this trend towards mainstreaming something that you've noticed from your studies from a European perspective? And have you sort of seen the kind of risks that I've inferred there happening? And can you think of any ways that we can mitigate the risks so mainstreaming is good to help the prospects for people with disabilities rather than losing any kind of specialist assistance, really? So any reflections on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you as well for inviting us today in this discussion. It's a pleasure to be here among you. Indeed, the trend that you are referring to is something that we are also seeing, and I think that has to do as well with this shift in our minds, and also with the introduction of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, on how we can move forward from supporting people or caring for people in more segregated models of care towards more mainstream environments that are based in the community and so on. So indeed, we see that specifically what we see from our members who are service providers supporting people in every aspect of their life, including also supporting them in employment, is that they are reaching more and more towards mainstream actors, and that they are also have a huge role to play in transferring know-how towards mainstream services. So indeed, we see this trend as you are referring. However, at the same time, something that we also need to bring in the discussion, and it was also touched upon previously by Ingrid and her experiences through Ontario, is that mainstream services and mainstream employment support is not always accessible to people with disabilities, and at the same time they do not have the specialized knowledge that is required to support people, especially people with higher support needs. So what we are witnessing, and what we think it's the best approach, is to have this like twin track approach, where you have specialized services providing direct support, and at the same time they are reaching out to mainstream actors and building their capacity. So this, we believe, can mitigate certain risks, and one of them is not also losing the expertise and the specialized knowledge that they have, because it's a matter also of how you can tailor the support, how you can offer this person-centered support by placing the person in the center of planning. And I think specialized services know or are keen to better identify how they can best do that in a way. then you ask me as well of, like how we can get this like balance right. And looking across Europe, there are like two models of employment for persons with disabilities. And one of them has to do with models that, like really are apply and support people to work on the open labor market. And this has to do with supported employment, individual placements, among others. And there are the more protected employment schemes, which are working environments that are adapted towards the needs of the people. So this is like the situation in Europe, across Europe. And indeed, we would argue that we need to scale up more the models such as supported employment services that can really further support people to work in the open labor market and truly supporting creating this meaningful and sustainable job employment. So I think finding the right balance between these two models can really help the transition and what we have been talking about, mitigate also this transition.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, there's lots of evidence that the more traditional approaches you sort of mentioned, Konstantina, has some quite negative consequences in terms of lock-in effects. The inability of people to really progress in their economic situation is often not helped very much at all by being in that kind of environment, apart from the obvious issues about stereotyping and social segregation, really. So indeed, kind of lots of moves that's a model we should be perhaps moving away from. The role of the public employment services, Konstantina, of course, always crucial to this kind of journey. We're hoping we can help people go along. When you think of 2 or 3 very practical things that public employment services could do more of or more frequently to try and assist the process you've described, really, and kind of generally improve the position from where we are now? So 2 or 3 things you'd like to recommend to public employment services generally. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, indeed, looking on public employment services, and it's interesting because recently the European Commission has been working on what they call a disability employment package. So one of these one of the elements of this package is also a toolkit, and this is a toolkit that they have developed, really demonstrating on how we can strengthen public employment services in order to further improve the labor market outcomes of persons with disabilities. And I think some of the elements that they refer there, which are quite interesting, is that we need to further also strengthen this more collaborative approach, collaborating with disability organizations, with employers, but also other stakeholders to truly design strategies that can help support people in finding employment. And at the same time, I think it's about also looking on successful practices. For example, we recently had a conference in Greece where we invited some representatives from different public employment services, and there are good practices and there are successful practices. We also heard from the previous speaker about different practices which really we need to identify, and we need to scale up and to communicate, to disseminate these good practices in order to learn from one another. And I think it has to do also with the skills of staff and how we can further, and this is also a quite crucial role that disability support organizations can play, since they can really support in building up the skills and the capacity of public employment services and their staff to better support persons with disabilities.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Again, very helpful interventions there. Perhaps if I could move, last but by no means least, actually, Peter, to yourself, really. You've spent a number of years, actually, in your kind of disability debrief, really kind of promoting some of the experiences of people who are trying to deal with the varying degrees of support they might receive from these different institutions, really, both a mixture of good and unfortunately not so good and successful interventions. You've also kind of operated on the global stage in terms of looking at issues to do with this sort of UN convention and how well or otherwise countries are in terms of following through some of the things that they have sensibly agreed to implement. Thinking about the big picture, really, if you were asked to kind of give a very, very brief, almost elevator pitch as to the big picture, really, thinking of the UN Convention, the way the narrative has changed over recent years, really, how well do you think disability inclusion is going globally? And I appreciate that's an incredibly vast question, but are you on the more positive end of the spectrum, or thinking really you've got rather more grave causes for concern, or perhaps somewhere in the middle? I mean, how do you see things going from a global perspective?
Nick, thanks, Eamon. Thanks everyone. Look, I would say if you asked me, I'm feeling today, with all that's going on in the world, it's not going to be great. But if you look at transformations over the past 20 or 30 years, disability is one of the subjects where there's been really profound social transformation. You can just see this on the streets in built architecture. There is accessibility in places where there weren't. There are assistance services in places where there weren't. There are disabled people prominent in media, in public life, every level and around the world. And these transformations are also visible in developing countries as well as the richer countries. I think also colleagues are talking about this big mindset shift, right, embodied in the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its UN message about the right to work and the right to work in the open labour market. So you're shifting from this idea that disabled people are something that needs to be looked after or hidden or kind of neutralized, to saying, well, actually, we need to sort of enable the opportunities that are there and provide assistance and break down barriers. And it's partly also a shift that then goes beyond like looking at the individual to looking at the wider patterns of social change and barriers in say like transport to get to work, or in the workplace, or in the employer attitudes and the barriers that they are making, or in terms of anti-discrimination legislation. So I'd say that there's a big shift there. But I think kind of something you're also indicating is that just like realizing this on the ground for disabled people, some of it is coming through very tangibly. And sort of I grew up with a disabled person in the 80s and 90s, and the previous generation of disabled activists made my life different. And I think the disabled person growing up today also has a different set of opportunities, but maybe also challenges. In terms of like the labour market issue, there's just revisiting International Labour Organization research before the call. One of their assessments, data from 60 countries, is that 7 in 10 persons with disabilities are inactive in the labour force. That is, like, they're neither in employment or unemployed. So they're not searching for work either. And that's compared to 4 in 10 persons without disabilities. So you can see that is still a really big juncture. And then there's another important fact from a different piece of research on the wage that people get. And that's persons with disabilities are paid 12% less than other employees on average. And even when you adjust for education, age, and type of work, there's still a 9%. There's still a 9% difference. So just a random example. I was also revisiting the links. I think there's an interesting study. I think it was in Sweden, where they sent out CVs to employers, and in some CVs they made clear the applicant was disabled, and in other CVs they didn't. And the same CVs in each case, the quote-unquote non-disabled applicants got a lot more callbacks. So there's something like, this is just sort of very tangible example. Like now someone's doing that research with that intent, and there are these methods, but you've just still got really, really profound barriers. There's a kind of like, bigger picture answer to that.
Thank you. The latter point, you're mentioning some kinds, unfortunately, sad attitudes based on pure prejudice, which we'd hope has improved to an extent, but certainly we've got a vast journey to still go on to kind of overcome some of that view. There's also this long-standing debate about the kind of role of the social security, unemployment, social security systems, disability benefit systems, etc., which I don't think has come a lot closer to resolution in the last 30 or 40 years I've been involved in some of this field personally, actually. Do you think, Peter, really eventually be the role of income replacement, social insurance, incapacity benefit systems, etc., in kind of hopefully moving people towards employment, but moving people towards quality employment and decent jobs, really? There are all sorts of issues that people move generally, not just disabled people, but others, from receipt of benefits into work, but their overall kind of life situation and economic situation is not radically improved. And I think people with disabilities are perhaps more at risk of that than many others, actually. So are there any good examples you've seen, or
particularly? Well, I want to sort of point to really profound tension here. If you give someone a benefit because you're saying they can't work, that will really lock in the fact that they quote unquote can't work. It also sort of creates a disincentive. Something that we profoundly need to shift is the association of disability supports with the association of supports for people that can't work. These are profoundly two different things. The barriers that someone has in terms of their disability, say the assistance support that they need, or the technology they might need to purchase, or whatever, are related to their disability, not to their ability to work. Right? In terms of these ability to work and capacity benefits, I think it's kind of really this is really it would be really difficult to do, even if you were doing them in good faith, right? But we see in many places that they're not done in good faith. And I mean, we British people are always proud of sort of world-beating examples, but I think we've got sort of a really prominent negative example in how we've dealt with this, and so that our Department for Work and Pensions has classified people as fit to work 2 weeks before they've died. And so this is just like, that is not good. That is not good for anyone. And this is a system where pushing people into work is sort of like creating harms. Paradoxically, this is also a place where we have, like, on paper, what might be good practices of this division, right? So we have like a disability benefit, personal independence payment, that is unrelated to work status and not means tested. So that's about compensating for barriers. We have a system, a benefit called access to work, which supports the adjustments and other costs disabled people need to access work, and it's cost shared between the employer and the government. So like on paper, these are ideal schemes. Obviously, if you tweak the implementation, put in a bit of sort of just regular bureaucratic incompetence and sort of and accompany it with a punitive policy direction, they will not work, right? Sirlis was mentioning that you can register for being unemployed in a minute online, do it digitally in Estonia. In England, to get this supposed disability benefit, when I came back to live in this country, I had to phone them up so that they could send me a form, which I then filled in paper. It took 2 months for them to send me a form, and the only customization of it was my name and address on the top. And this is after then they send me a text message saying, if you don't fill the form in, then you won't get the benefit. And it's like, well, I didn't get the form. I then, as a disabled person, have to fill in 20 pages about my intimate life in a time period shorter than it took them to send me the form. So this, I mean, just to give insights into these punitive systems. But the Estonia example made me think about a bit of lack of digitization here.
Thank you, indeed. I mean, so there are some conceptual issues. I think a point you really make very well there, Peter, is that a lot of the fundamental building blocks of the welfare system are based on the assumptions of 60, 70, 80 years ago, the world has moved on in some ways in a good way, but the basic fundamental, foundations of benefit systems have not really been amended, and there's an obvious tension there. And perhaps before moving to the sort of open discussion, I've had the pleasure of visiting Estonia a few times actually, and an Estonian colleague once told me that you can do everything online in Estonia apart from register a divorce for obvious practical reasons, rather than there's clear functionality. And I think it's the system is incredibly kind of slick actually and user friendly there, which is obviously a great advantage for people who need support very quickly. Thank you all for your really fascinating kind of insights. I've kind of jotted down a few general views from hearing from all of your expertise, which is extremely rich and valuable. One thing that struck me is maybe a lack of ownership of the agenda, really, maybe from a government perspective, maybe more widely. But I mean, who should really be taking the lead from a sort of, a civil society or institutional perspective in dealing with some of these issues, really? Or is it about better collaboration between all the actors without somebody taking the lead? Or is there really a role for employment departments, social security departments, lobby organisations? I mean, who should be at the centre of driving this agenda forward to make the improvements that you've also kind of clearly identified? Anyone like to offer a view on that?
Maybe I can kick it off.
Please, yeah, thank you, Ingrid. Yeah,
I think there isn't. I don't think there is one person, one department. I think that may be some of the issues here, is that this misunderstanding that, well, when you're in school, you belong to the educational department. When you are in, when you come out and you're looking for work, you're, mandated by the Ministry of Labor. And if you can't get work, then your Ministry of Community Services will take care of you. Here in Ontario, we a number of organizations, a number of school boards have adopted a global program called Project Search, and that was originated out of the Cincinnati Children's Hospital from a nurse that was quite shocked by the fact that all of these children who had developmental disabilities were being served by them, but nobody that looked like these kids were working in the hospital. And so when she looked at this, she's like, why don't we have people that look like these children represented in the ones that are serving them? So what I'm trying to say is this program, it integrates community, employment, and education in order to create a training program that now has students who have intellectual disabilities in their last year of high school doing internships in a business host, but is interministerial. Everything that is about that program has to have a number of ministries coming together to make it work. So if the school board is not on board, if the business is not on board, if the Ministry of Labor is not, or Education is not on board, that program doesn't work. So to address what you had just asked, who is accountable for this? I think everybody needs to be. Everybody, if we put people who have a disability at the center of what is being planned, then there are many stakeholders that need to be have that capacity built, just as Konstantina was talking about. It's collaborative, and it's about how do we build capacity. So taking disability from a medical model to a social model. So when a child is born who has a disability, that family is provided with supports that allows them to see their child as integral part of their community and not segregated. When that child goes into school, now the school can have supports to ensure that that child is educated properly along the side with all the students. When they're going into high school, how do we ensure that they have access to work experiential opportunities to build the soft skills? Because the business will teach them the technical skill, but how do we build the soft skills that are so needed so that they can succeed? And then when they enter the workplace, how do we ensure that there are wraparound supports to help them? We haven't touched on intersectionality here, but disability is just a piece. Peter was talking about transportation. He's absolutely correct. If you don't have access to the transportation because of your socioeconomic situation, if you are being discriminated because of your race on top of your disability, like there is this concept of other layers coming together that are are impacting people's abilities to succeed in the labor market.
Yeah.
So who owns it? I don't know. I think it's much more complicated than one person.
Indeed. Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating observations there, Ingrid. I suppose what you're clearly kind of sharing with us a view, there needs to be some kind of longitudinal follow-through support for somebody from a very young age through their lives, but particularly the transition from work education into employment. It doesn't happen very often or very well, I think, for all sorts of reasons. But would any of you, yourself, Ingrid, or other colleagues, like to say, is it not happening because of a lack of understanding of the need for it? Is it not happening because, unfortunately, people think there's an economic cost they're not prepared to meet for it, or any other reason, really? Because we do pick up a picture of people often being kind of bounced from pillar to post in the system, really, which is not particularly treating them as individuals, maybe just dealing with them with certain labels, but lots of gaps, really, at different transitions and important stages in their life, I think, really, is what we often find. Why do people think it doesn't happen? Or perhaps examples of where it does? Because people with disabilities clearly need a much more effective transition, don't they, from different key stages from employment into work? Yeah, Peter, what's your view? Perhaps.
I think that's a really great question that I'm going to have to recuperate on. But one interesting model where a sort of more joined up approach is used as return to work programs, where someone has acquired disability or injury through their working life, and then programs work with them and with the employer. I think sort of Canada has quite a famous one. There's interesting examples in Malaysia, and I think those are particularly interesting for wider labour market and PS concerns as well, because there aren't common examples of like how you help someone career change, right? But actually, return to work is a methodology that has been used over decades that do help people navigate serious impacts in their life life and career circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. Is there something about the performance metrics that are applied by government departments and others to kind of measure their success, quote unquote, in kind of delivery of programs? So should they be looking at something a bit more or a bit less binary than somebody being in work or out of work, really? Should they be given some kind of credit for people who improve somebody's wider social situation, maybe? Because employment services are obviously focused on job outcomes, but is that in itself kind of a bit of a blunt, inappropriate measure for trying to kind of integrate people with disabilities, maybe? Any views there? See you smiling there, Peter. So please, what's your view on that one?
This is quite an interesting one, because I've sort of evaluated a program that was set up to sort of get people into work, and then they were like, no, we're improving employability. You're like, wow, that's not the same thing, is it? And you're kind of like, you see it kind of both ways, because then, like you say, they are doing useful things and the soft skills, and sort of people are really isolated in their homes and whatnot. This program was evaluating this in Egypt, but it could be in other places. But then you also see there's the the stigma of low expectations, right? And unfortunately, a pattern here is, with respect to our colleagues in service providers, that pattern of low expectations can be locked in by service providers who aren't getting results, aren't transferring to the open labour market, are just reproducing training programs, and someone is sort of professionally going to training programs for a living. So I think a lot more nuance in these in these targets, different forms of measurement, different forms of support, recognition of the scale of the problem, which goes far beyond the quote unquote employability. You need to getting ready to go to work, but without stopping there. It's a very tricky one, but I'm glad you brought it up.
Thank you. Konstantina, I wonder whether perhaps social enterprises, do you think, could be playing more? I mean, they do a very good role at the moment. Could they be playing more of a role, particularly, do you think, in supporting people with disabilities journeys into work, really? Have you got any examples from around Europe that are particularly positive, or do you feel social enterprises have got a role that could be perhaps enhanced, possibly?
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, so no problem. I'll bring you in next. Thank you very much. So Konstantina and then Sirlis. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, indeed, across Europe, we see like these two different like models, and one of them has to do with models that are adapting their working environments to workers with disabilities, and this can take different forms. They can take the form of social economy enterprises, shelter workshops, work integration social enterprises, special employment centers in Spain, among others. And honestly, really looking across Europe, it's very, very difficult to really better understand exactly and characterize exactly its model and like how its model is defined. So in general, there are vast differences, and of course there are good practices that exist within the social economy sector. However, from here I would like maybe to start from a first point, and that has to do, I wanted to bring it a little before as well when Peter was talking, that the possibilities for work for persons with disabilities, especially people with higher support needs, they often depend on the support that is available to them. And this is something that I think that we need to really look into. For example, there are supported employment schemes, there are job carving approaches, there are supported internships or supported apprenticeships that they have proven quite successful in supporting people accessing and retaining employment, especially in the open labor market. However, these are small, innovative pilot projects. They have not been scaled up across Europe, and they are not backed up as well by enabling legal and funding frameworks. So I think this is something that we need to invest and to look on how we can really scale up these models. Now, when it comes to social economy actors, they play a very important role. And despite the fact that, the way that they are characterized and recognized across Europe is different, and it can be too broad and not nuanced enough, they are in many cases and in most countries the only employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. And I think this role should be recognized, and especially in rural areas, they might even be the biggest employer, which they don't just support persons with disabilities, but they support also the community as a whole. For sure, it is a question on how we can better support social enterprises and social economy organizations in order to further promote fair working conditions, equal remuneration, opportunities for growth, for career growth, and how they can truly also support people transition towards open labor market employment. For sure, these are things that we can discuss and we need to discuss, and there, for example, taxation, state aid, public procurement play a really big role.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the ONCE Foundation in Spain, of course, is a famous example of an organisation that started out particularly looking for people with disabilities employment prospects, and it's grown very much now into a wider service provider with some success. But thank you. Sirlis, please. Thank you. Very patiently there. You wanted to come in, so please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I just wanted to. You had a question, who should take a lead?
Yes. Yeah.
Or in case of Estonia, the state took a lead, and it was very pragmatic reason. We just had very heavy burden on incapacity of work pension budget, and as a small country as we are, we just can't have so many people in the working age who are not active in the labor market. So it's kind of needed. We had to do something, and we're happy that we did the right things. But what one thing I wanted to comment that had also very positive role was an attitude. And during this reform period, or during the last decade, it's very important to point out that the change in attitudes that favors the recruitment and employment of people with reduced ability as a positive effect. So, and that we also found out or know that we have seen that employers' awareness of health restrictions and their impact on job promotions is low. So as a result of that, employers may have preconceptions. They actually lack of awareness how to adapt the workplace or job tasks. So it doesn't mean that they don't want to hire people with disabilities, but they are just they have preconceptions, they are a bit afraid. So, and what we are doing or try to do is we provide counseling and information service for employers, just to give an overview how to support people with different health limitations or special needs in workplace. But really, it's not only employers, it's kind of an overall attitude. And the positive thing in case of Estonia is that because of there were a lot of discussions, a lot of interviews in newspapers during the reform, we talk a lot in a society about the people with disabilities, how that they can work, and what do they need, and what kind of adaptations, and it has had a very positive effect. So that we have been that's successful, and but of course there is a long way to go. Although there has been a positive effect, changes in attitudes, however, changes in attitudes are still seen as a major challenge also in Estonia.
Thank you. Ingrid, please. Yeah, I see your hand raised, so thank you.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a point that Sirlis was making on the state taking the lead. Here in Canada, our federal government did put a challenge for themselves to hire a number of people who have disabilities, and in doing so wanted to reach out to organizations that were supporting people so that, you know, that challenge could be met. And so I think she's absolutely correct that it has to start from the very top, a demonstration that as a country, we intentionally want to have people who have disabilities as contributors in our local economy. And the second point I want to do is in this concept of employer awareness. I think it's across the globe that we're still talking about bringing awareness for employers about the potential and capacities and competencies that people who have a disability bring to the table. I haven't heard of any panel where we say, you know, that's done. We've met our goal of bringing awareness and confidence. That continues to be a point that we continuously are working on here at ODEN. Across, you know, our country, we have an organization like ODEN that deals with support on employment across Canada, and we're always talking about the fact that we have to continuously debunk myths, correct misconceptions, and bring awareness to the contributions that people can make, and of the fact that employment service providers exist. Many employers, we have data that shows that many employers are not aware that specialized services in their communities exist, not just to support job seekers, but to support them. And that is another whole concept that needs to be debunked. The concept that, you know, these agencies are there for people who have a disability and that's it. No, they're here for the business community as well, to help them understand how you attract, hire, on board, and promote somebody who has a disability within your organization.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, because the whole concept of supporting employers on this agenda is actually far, far less apparent or developed, so it would seem, in most countries than the support for the disabled job seekers themselves, actually. Any views why that is? Is that because people simply haven't made the logical step that obviously successful employment policies require employers to be engaged, or is there something perhaps more complicated behind it? Because we very rarely hear about systematic government support to assist employers on this agenda, really. I mean, yeah, Peter, your view, please. Thank you.
Yeah, a few things. I think, like, first to reiterate this point, this is one of the key failures of schemes to promote employment for disabled people. If you just work on one side of the puzzle, namely the disabled people, that does not work. That just leads to infinite infinite training loop. You need to work on both the employment conditions and supporting disabled people and making that match. In terms of schemes, there are some quite interesting schemes, and there's plus and minus. Anya mentioned Disability Confident in the UK at the beginning, and recent research has sort of suggested that it's kind of employers signing up to like well-meaning sort of statement that they'll try and hire employed and hire disabled people. It's kind of shown that the employers on the Disability Confidence Scheme are not doing any better than employers not on the Disability Confidence Scheme. So as with other areas, the tokenism is there. There are, I was involved when I worked with the International Labour Organization. I was involved with business and disability networks, and that is quite a interesting scheme. Like, we have to recognize employers' agency and their own terms in these aspects. I think there's been a limitation also from the disability community and disability organizations that we continue to put things in our terms, like say, oh, there's a right to work, or you should do this or whatever, rather than their terms, right? That you're doing a business, this will help your business in this way and this way, this way. Or if you're a government agency or a different type of employer or a small business, like there's just a different set of logic and shifting to that. I still see the disability organizations really struggle with that and making those bridges. And then like turns into another reason why making these spaces for employers to network and share practices on their terms is quite important. So I mean, your point's true, but that's I think an interesting methodology and for people to look up. So there are now in many countries business and disability networks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when one looks at any of the employment figures, whether it's on the basis of gender, youth, older people, or particularly disability, clearly employers are missing out on the opportunity to employ the best people for a job, because the figures wouldn't show stark kind of variances, unfortunately. Perhaps building on from that point just now, is it still a lack of awareness about support? Is it still some extremely outmoded and prejudicial views about reasons why people shouldn't be employing the best person for the job because they happen to have a disability? Or is it something more complicated again, really? Would anybody like to offer a view about, is the barrier simply we're not doing enough to publicise support schemes? Is it the policies are not well designed? Is it purely that people still are kind of caught in some, unfortunately, very archaic mindset, really? Or a mixture of all of the above, perhaps? Any views there, really? Konstantina, thank you. Yeah.
It's a mixture of everything that you mentioned, and like we have been mentioning. From our side as well, we see it because we often like hear that like open labor market employment can be considered even closed for some people with disabilities, and basically across Europe. And like there has been also this push in a way, if we can call it like that, where we need to transition away from protected employment towards like open labor market employment, which we agree, but at the same time, is open labor market employment open and accessible for persons with disabilities? And I think there are a lot of misconceptions as well that we need to debunk, that we need to address. For example, we often hear about like employer relevant costs that come with employing persons with disabilities. And a recent study that the European Disability Forum did, actually they found out that most reasonable accommodations come at no cost for the employers because they are mainly flexible working hours, and or if they come, they are less than 500 euros per person. So like this, I think it's a myth that we need to address, that we need to debate. And at the same time, it has to do also with different schemes that are in place. For example, state aid can be a really powerful tool to really support any type of cost related that has to do with employing a person with disability in your business. For example, it can provide support for training. It can provide support to pay for the job codes that can come as part of a supported employment scheme, and it can pay for various other aspects, elements. However, is it used? No. Is it used by mainstream employers? No, it's not. And it's a matter of lack of awareness, but it's a matter of like fear from public authorities on what state aid constitutes, and also not getting into like collaboration and dialogue with also the European Commission to better understand what is state aid and how it can best be used for this. And it's a matter on how also we can further open up the open labor market. And here is where public procurement can play a very important role, and especially social responsible public procurement. For example, for sure, public procurement can support through this like purpose that that it has to support with really accessing specific contracts, specific tenders only for social economic actors. But there are elements within the European Public Procurement Directive that can actually open up employment opportunities for persons with disabilities in the open labor market. And this is something that we have been advocating for within the European Commission. So there are tools. It's a matter of fact that we do not use the tools that we have.
Okay, thank you. Sadly, we're moving to the end of our slot. I think well, these discussions are always fascinating, and an hour and a half goes very quickly, and we wouldn't like to abuse your goodwill by a longer slot, but we often think we need to schedule them for a longer period. But I'll leave on perhaps a slightly optimistic note, hopefully. I'm a great advocate of the whole job carving, job shaping agenda, and I wrote a report with some colleagues from Vienna about 6 or 7 years ago, which was interesting. I'm surprised job carving hasn't perhaps gained a bit more traction, but perhaps that's a discussion for another salon another day. But I was at an ILO project in Kathmandu about a month ago and asked any questions, and somebody jumped up and said, "Oh, I read this paper on job carving that you wrote in 2019, which was quite nice actually, and quite not the agenda and quite out of the blue." But I'm thinking, so therefore maybe awareness can be raised kind of slowly but surely. So that was quite gratifying actually. That agenda appears to be becoming a bit more global. So thank you all very much indeed for your very, very informative and rich interventions. It's been a great pleasure talking to all of you, and thank you very much for your comments and reflections. Anya, have you got any kind of perhaps summary observations from the extremely interesting comments from our 4 colleagues? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you to everybody for a really fascinating discussion, very important, very timely. I have noted a couple of sort of takeaways and this sort of a so what's from our discussion. I think one of the aspects that struck me is that we need to balance efficiency with accessibility. Reforms aim to improve efficiency, but they also risk prioritizing administrative goals over the needs of real persons with disabilities, making the services in some instances harder to access. We talked about mainstreaming versus specialized support. The integration of disability employment support into mainstreaming can create opportunities, but it also creates risks. I think we all agreed that a twin track approach almost, maintaining those specialized services while improving mainstream accessibility is critical. We talked about digitalization that can improve and be a tool to open up access, but it needs to be designed with collaboration and in co-creation with those who the digital tools are supposed to serve. We also spoke about shifting narrative from those who deliver those services, but also you spoke about employers and the aspects of building awareness, making sure that they are invited to join at an early stage. They understand what the benefits are of bringing persons with disabilities on board. We talked about, Peter, you mentioned about linking benefits to participation without punishment, making sure that the systems are designed to serve those people rather than be a just punitive stick, for lack of better expression. We spoke about joining up. The ownership should come from all the stakeholders that participate in the supporting of the support of people, persons with disabilities. That if we put the person in the center and bring everybody on board, that is the important starting point in this aspect. And the systemic approach, Ingrid, you mentioned about education, career progression, making young people who are at schools, who are within the educational system, aware of what the opportunities are there in their future life, bringing them into practical employment experiences, not just confined within the school and education system. And I think one of the aspects that really struck me is that progress in disability rights has been made, but it hasn't really truly always translated into economic inclusion. And that we have seen that attitudes have improved, but employment rates still in many parts of the world remain low. So the sort of almost 4 points that I jotted as the so what from the discussion. I think one is that efficiency-driven reforms can backfire. So if mainstreaming or digitalization is implemented without the safeguards, it can result in exclusion rather than inclusion. Tailored support is essential. One size fits all doesn't work. Technology must be inclusive. Employers need active support. Benefit reforms is crucial. Systems should remove barriers to work rather than create dependencies. And overall, a holistic reform deliver better outcomes, as we have heard from Estonia. These would be my takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So as we draw the end of our discussion, thank our colleagues again. Just like to wish Ingrid, good morning in Ontario. So Konstantina and Peter, good afternoon for Brussels in the UK, and almost early evening in Tallinn for you, Sirlis, in Tallinn, Estonia. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you. Very fascinating discussion. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Bye-bye.